Welcome back. You're watching Brand Equity and I'm Sonali Krishna. Now, a few weeks ago, Barc released its All India data, which for the first time included ratings from rural India. This much-awaited data had some startling findings in the English entertainment and English news genre in particular. For instance, the data claims that 41% of the total audience viewing English entertainment channels comes from rural India. Another startling fact being that 52% of the total audience viewing English news comes from rural India, which really seemed a little too much to digest. So we decided to check with media agency heads and leading marketers if they found these data points credible enough to change their investment patterns. Vijay Ravi reports. Digest this.
41% of English entertainment is watched by rural.
Surprised? So were we. But if Barc's latest rural ratings data is to be believed, then English entertainment and English news seem to be rather popular with rural folks. The data suggests that 52% of the viewership for English news channels comes from rural, and 41% of the viewership for English general entertainment comes from rural as well.
The way the whole consumption pattern of television or television viewing, you're seeing amazing differences. For example, category close to your thing would be English news, for example. English news. Do you know that 52% of English news is actually watched by non-metros? We have always believed metros and 1 million plus towns are the English news catchment. 52%. English entertainment, take English entertainment, 41% of English entertainment is watched by rural. So the whole aspirational, which, see, there are different other data points which actually tell you the same story, that the whole aspirational part of India is actually wanting to watch more English and stuff like that. But this data actually tells you that. It's very, very clearly coming out.
Undoubtedly, this seems counterintuitive and a big surprise to both media agency heads and advertisers. It's not just English news and English entertainment that have high rural viewership. 40% of the audience for English movies and 39% of infotainment too comes from rural.
Entertainment in rural was always expected, whether it is through package form like television. Of course, there are factors like availability of electricity, etc. But in the DTH world, signal is not the question. There were different factors. But I think the anticipation probably would have been that it might have been local language or it might have been mainstream Bollywood or things of that nature. So the degree to which English seems to be having a following is a bit of a surprise. I think some of that may have also got facilitated because over the last several years, a lot of English products have been dubbed in languages, so people have become familiar with it.
Yes, I actually really can't hazard a guess in terms of what percentage we were expecting. But 41% and 52% does seem a little bit on the higher side. So to that extent, maybe it's about 5-10% on the higher side than what we were originally thought of. So we want to first wait and see in terms of consistency of the data. Number two, we would like to see what is the amount of time that they are spending on this, both the news channel and the GEC. It's only after that we will take any calls on this.
One of the key reasons for the significant spike witnessed in rural viewing, especially when one looks at it in the context of the English genre, is the shift from SEC or socio-economic classification used by TAM to moving to NCCS or the new consumer classification system used by Barc. This has in turn completely changed the way one defines rural. And this change has impacted the entire rural-urban viewing pattern, so to speak.
Before specifically going into these two genres that you spoke about, I think one should also remember the fact that Barc is using the 2011 definition for rural. Basis which, of course, more than 70% of the population of the country is classified as rural. I think the number is close to 74%. And it also doesn't really mean that rural is only small towns and villages. What is a bit surprising though is, of course, the number which you spoke about for the English entertainment genre, which is about 40% of total viewership coming from rural India, again as per the recent data. But there again, of course, if one delves into the details, one has found that a majority of that viewership has actually come from one single channel, and in fact a new property which was started on that channel. Then the channel happens to be AXN and the property or the program happens to be Fear Factor, and that seems to have created a spike in viewership in rural India. In fact, another important point to be noted is, unlike in the earlier measurement system, Barc is not smoothing out the ratings. They're actually reporting the numbers as is, and hence every time one sees a spike or a fall in ratings and one links it back, there is a certain event or there is a certain story behind that number. So it's early days yet, but like I said, these numbers do have an explanation.
NCCS itself has brought certain changes. For example, just now if you look at urban and rural, in the SEC system we didn't have rural at all. It used to be the R1 R2 system, but in the NCCS system almost 40% of the people come from rural, and NCCS is defined by the number of durables that you actually own. So traditionally we used to imagine SEC very urban based, but NCCS is not. NCCS has almost 40% contribution from rural. As a result, the kind of ratings that you're seeing, the kind of TV viewership that you're seeing also has changed to a certain extent. It's not like what we used to imagine rural would be. It's no longer rural as people who can't afford. Our rural people have really been changing, and I think we need to reimagine them too.
The good news, however, is that at least from here on, once the data is viewed for a number of months, will give us a much more accurate sense of what non-metros and smaller towns are actually watching. While most advertisers are thrilled with the arrival of rural ratings, they say that they will take their time before using it as their media investing Bible.
The first reaction is a bit of a surprise because it is a little counterintuitive. At first level, your response is this true kind of, feeling that you get, especially with respect to English news. English news and rural audience seems to be a little completely off balance. So yes, it is surprising at first level. So from my perspective, at this stage, I would not want to take this data and base my media plans on it. I would still want to combine this with the current experiential information that we have, what TAM has shared with us through the years. You would take a mix of all these views and do a kind of a, more experiential plan rather than just take the Barc data and start planning around it.
The view was that if you're reaching upper SCCA, you go to English channel because that's where it becomes effective, and then you can look at other channels for other purposes. That logic now gets shifted a little bit, that there is a much broader viewership. And so if you're utilizing a channel, is your communication one that everyone will understand and appreciate? What's the kind of ads you will put out there? I think there'll be some bit of rethink that may take place. I'm not surprised that there's some degree of disbelief, but if the Barc process is sound and this data proves consistent, then it actually supports the other hypothesis on the demand for English in general and why it's growing. And just seems to have reached a level that we hadn't anticipated, and the speed with which it has reached there. And if that is indeed borne out, then I think people will use it a lot more.
But what does this mean for the English genre at large? Does significant viewership from rural India spell good or bad news for English broadcasters, given that their pitch to advertisers till date was pivoted around attracting urban, top-end and affluent audiences?
If we find that the number of people actually who are viewing is much higher and much larger, that's good news, right? So my cost per thousands are actually lower, and the client should feel happier. The difficulty will be is that because we assume that the cost per thousand is to a certain set of people, if we find that these number of people are far more, will the client be pushing us saying, oh, this is a new cost per thousand definition, and that's what we need to now keep getting for all the genres? Or will the channel be able to push up and say you were paying only for X and you found that you actually got 2x of people watching, so now you pay us higher.
For a lot of brands in the market, they get more business from rural India than from urban India. And obviously going forward, the growths as well are going to be a lot more from there. So for all this while, it was really in that sense underserved, and now with rural ratings becoming available, I'm sure advertisers would look at investing their TV budgets more in sync with some of these markets. Not just advertisers and media planners, but I also see a similar thing happening from the content side, from the broadcaster side. I'm sure we will see a lot more channels and a lot more properties, programs being created, being invested in for these audiences.
Let's assume just for a second that this data holds steady. Will that really translate into advertisers targeting rural India via English broadcasters? Seems rather unlikely, even if one assumes that this trend will only gain momentum in the coming years.